June 19th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Philippine Sea. The water is flat and metallic, stretching to the horizon without movement. Above it, the sky is already alive. On the deck of an American aircraft carrier, engines cough into motion, propellers whir, deck crews move with reversed urgency, hands signaling, bodies bending low against the wind. Every motion is timed, every second accounted for. Below deck, fuel lines are primed, elevators rise and fall. Fighters roll forward, one after another, disappearing into the morning air. The cycle never stops. Launch, recover, refuel, rearm, launch again. Hundreds of miles away, Japanese pilots climb into their cockpits under a different rhythm. Longer distances, fewer replacements, tired ground crews, aircraft that must make every strike count because there may not be time for another. This battle will not be decided by who flies bravest. It will be decided by who can move faster, reset quicker, and repeat the process without breaking. As the sun lifts higher, two carrier forces accelerate toward collision, carrying with them years of doctrine, training, and hidden limitations that are about to be exposed. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a decisive phase. For the United States, the long island-hopping campaign was no longer about survival. It was about closing the distance to Japan itself. Every operation now carried strategic weight beyond the battlefield, each captured airfield and anchorage tightening the perimeter around the Japanese home islands. At the center of this tightening noose lay the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. To American planners, these islands were more than stepping stones. They were launch platforms. From their coral runways, the new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. For the first time, the industrial heart of Japan would be within sustained bombing range. If the Marianas fell, the war would enter an entirely new and more dangerous chapter for Japan. Japanese leadership understood this with absolute clarity. Since 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy had watched its defensive perimeter collapse outward. Solomons, New Guinea, the Gilberts, the Marshalls. Each retreat had been justified as temporary. The Marianas could not be. They were declared part of the inner defense line, politically and psychologically inseparable from the home islands. Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, believed the Marianas must be defended at all costs. Losing them would not merely shorten the war, it would expose Japan's vulnerability to its own people. Thus, when American amphibious forces moved towards Saipan in June 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy activated Operation A-Go. This was to be the decisive carrier battle Japan had been waiting for. The plan rested on a familiar idea: draw the American fast carrier forces into range, strike them with massed air attacks, and destroy enough flight decks to halt the invasion. The logic echoed earlier successes at Pearl Harbor in early 1942, but the conditions were no longer the same. The Japanese carrier force assembled for A-Go was formidable on paper: 9 carriers, over 400 aircraft, veteran commanders with decades of naval aviation experience. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa took command of the mobile fleet, sailing east from the Philippines. His carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and others, represented the remaining core of Japanese naval aviation. But beneath the surface strength lay severe weaknesses. The greatest of these was time. Since the catastrophic losses at Midway in 1942 and the grinding attrition over Guadalcanal, Japan had been bleeding experienced pilots faster than it could replace them. Training programs had been shortened, flight hours reduced. Many pilots now entering combat had only a fraction of the experience their predecessors once possessed. In contrast, the American Navy transformed carrier warfare into a system. By 1944, American industrial output dwarfed that of every other nation combined. Essex-class carriers rolled off shipyards with assembly line efficiency. Aircraft production surged. Most importantly, pilot training pipelines expanded rather than contracted. Losses were absorbed, analyzed, and corrected. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, represented the culmination of this transformation. Task Force 58, the fast carrier striking arm, fielded 15 fleet and light carriers, protected by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. More than 900 aircraft stood ready. But numbers alone do not explain what was coming. American carriers now operated as integrated machines. Radar detected incoming threats hundreds of miles away. Combat information centers tracked formations in real time. Fighter direction officers guided interceptors with mathematical precision. Deck crews practiced launch and recovery cycles until they became reflex. Every improvement was small. Together, they compounded. As American forces closed in on Saipan, Spruance faced a dilemma. His orders were clear: protect the invasion fleet at all costs. He could not gamble recklessly. Ozawa, on the other hand, had no such luxury. He needed a decisive blow. Delay favored the Americans. Every hour strengthened their airfields and defenses. Two carrier fleets now moved toward each other across open ocean, not as mirror images, but as products of entirely different wartime realities. And at the center of it all lay an unglamorous truth. This battle would not be decided by who struck first, but who could strike again. That difference, still invisible on the horizon, was already shaping the outcome. By mid-1944, American and Japanese carriers no longer represented comparable tools of war. They were outwardly similar: flat decks, island superstructures, aircraft packed wing to wing, but beneath the steel, they belonged to different eras of naval thinking. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, carrier aviation had been built around elite skill. Pre-war doctrine assumed a small number of highly trained pilots would deliver decisive blows early in a conflict. Precision mattered more than sustainability. The system worked brilliantly in 1941 and early 1942, when Japan possessed the world's most experienced naval aviators and faced opponents unprepared for carrier warfare. But it was a system with little depth. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized long-range strikes launched in single, coordinated waves. Aircraft were fueled, armed, and spotted on deck in large groups, then launched together. It was an impressive spectacle, but it was also rigid. Once a strike was airborne, the deck often remained cluttered, unable to quickly cycle aircraft for defense or follow-up attacks. American doctrine evolved differently. The U.S. Navy had learned early that carriers would survive only if they could fight continuously. This required rapid deck cycles, launching, recovering, refueling, rearming aircraft in overlapping sequences. Rather than massing everything into one decisive strike, American carriers emphasized sustained pressure. This difference was reinforced by design. Essex-class carriers featured efficient deck layouts, powerful elevators, and ample aviation fuel storage. Damage control systems were extensive. Hangar decks were treated as working spaces, not just storage areas. Aircraft could be moved, serviced, and replaced at speed. Japanese carriers, even modern ones like Taiho, struggled to match this tempo. Limited ventilation, fuel handling vulnerabilities, and less flexible deck procedures slowed recovery times. A single mistake, a spilled fuel line, a blocked elevator, could halt operations. Training magnified these disparities. American pilots entering the Philippine Sea battle were products of a mature pipeline. They had logged hundreds of flight hours. Carrier landings were drilled repeatedly. Replacement pilots arrived continuously, already integrated into standardized procedures. Japanese training had become a race against time. Fuel shortages limited flight hours, veteran instructors were dead or deployed at the front, new pilots learned theory without repetition, many had never practiced carrier landings under combat conditions. Once committed to battle, there were few reserves to draw from. Even ground crews felt the difference. On American carriers, deck crews operated in color-coded teams, each man assigned a specific role. Ordnance handlers, fuel crews, plane captains, every task flowed into the next. Mistakes were documented and corrected across the fleet. Japanese deck crews were skilled but overworked. Smaller teams handled larger workloads. Replacement personnel were scarce. Fatigue accumulated quietly, day after day, long before the first aircraft was launched. Technology widened the gap further. American radar systems did more than provide early warning. They shaped decision-making. Incoming enemy aircraft were detected at long range, tracked continuously, and intercepted well before reaching the fleet. Fighters could land, refuel, and relaunch multiple times in a single day. Japanese radar coverage was limited and unreliable. Fighter direction relied heavily on visual contact and pre-planned timing. Once strikes were airborne, real-time coordination became difficult, especially over long distances. Distance itself became a weapon. Japanese aircraft were forced to operate at the extreme edge of their range. This meant less fuel for combat maneuvering and almost no margin for error. Damaged planes often ditched short of the fleet. Pilots who missed their carriers after dark were lost. American fighters, operating closer to their task forces, could cycle repeatedly. A single pilot might intercept, land, rearm, and intercept again, something Japanese pilots could rarely attempt. By the time the two fleets closed on the Philippine Sea, the contest was no longer symmetrical. One side was optimized for endurance, the other for a single, decisive moment. When that moment arrived, the clock would not stop. And as the battle opened, it became clear that time itself had chosen a side. Before the first enemy aircraft appeared on radar screens, the battle was already being fought on steel decks under an unforgiving sun. On American carriers, the flight deck was a place of repetition. Movements were stripped of emotion and reduced to procedure. Plane captains checked control surfaces. Ordnance crews locked bombs into place. Fuel hoses were connected, disconnected, and rolled away again. The same motions repeated dozens of times a day. This rhythm mattered. Each man understood not just his own task, but how it fed the next. A delayed fueling slowed arming. A misaligned aircraft blocked an elevator. Every error echoed across the deck. Over time, discipline replaced urgency. Calm replaced haste. For many sailors, this was not their first operation. Some had survived earlier battles, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Truk. Their confidence did not come from optimism, but from familiarity. They trusted the system because they had watched it work under fire. Japanese deck crews operated under a heavier burden. Their carriers carried fewer aircraft, but each one felt irreplaceable. Crews worked with care, knowing that damaged planes might never be repaired, and lost pilots could not be replaced. Fatigue was constant, sleep came in fragments, the tropical heat punished metal and men alike. When alarms sounded, the pressure intensified. There was no margin for repetition. Each launch had to succeed the first time. This difference in human tempo shaped the battle as surely as any aircraft. Carrier warfare in 1944 was no longer just about aircraft performance, it was about information. On American ships, radar operators tracked contacts long before they became visible. Blips on green screens turned into altitude estimates, headings, and speeds. In combat information centers deep inside the ships, officers translated data into decisions. Fighters were launched not in desperation, but in anticipation. American pilots were guided to intercept points calculated minutes in advance. They climbed to altitude while enemy formations were still assembling. When fuel ran low, they returned, landed,
refueled, and launched again, sometimes within an hour. The deck cycle became a weapon. Japanese forces lacked this advantage. Radar detection was inconsistent, and fighter direction depended on pre-arranged plans. Pilots were often launched too early or too late. Once airborne, they flew long distances with little guidance, burning fuel before reaching combat. Every minute lost in coordination was a minute stolen from recovery. As the battle approached, this invisible contest of timing began to tilt decisively. At the highest level, the two fleets were guided by different imperatives. Admiral Raymond Spruance was cautious by nature. His priority was clear: protect the amphibious forces at Saipan. He resisted the temptation to chase Ozawa aggressively, keeping his carriers positioned to defend rather than pursue. Critics would later debate his restraint, but in June 1944, caution aligned perfectly with American strengths. By holding position, Spruance forced Japanese aircraft to fly longer distances, stretching their range and compressing their options. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa faced the opposite reality. He needed to strike first, and strike hard. His plan relied on long-range attacks, coordinated precisely across multiple carrier groups. Delay meant failure. Every hour without contact increased the risk of detection and interception. Ozawa understood the risks. He accepted them because there were no alternatives. As dawn broke on June 19th, both commanders committed to paths shaped by forces larger than themselves. One trusted endurance, the other gambled on a moment. The air above the Philippine Sea was about to reveal which approach could survive repetition.
The Philippine Sea was vast, an open expanse that magnified every tactical decision. Japanese strike doctrine relied on range. Ozawa intended to use land-based aircraft from Guam and his carrier air groups together, forcing American fighters to divide their attention. In theory, the distances favored Japan. American carriers would be attacked from multiple directions over hundreds of miles. In practice, distance became a trap. Japanese carrier aircraft launched from extreme range to avoid early detection. This meant flying at economical speeds, conserving fuel before combat even began. When intercepted, pilots had little room to maneuver. Prolonged dogfights were not an option. Every turn consumed fuel they could not spare. American fighters faced no such constraint. Operating closer to their carriers, Hellcats could climb aggressively, fight, disengage, and return. Interceptions happened in layers, far from the fleet, then closer, then directly overhead. If one group of fighters missed contact, another would be waiting. The geometry of the battle bent toward repetition. Japanese strikes arrived in waves that could not be regenerated. American defenses could be. For Japanese pilots, the approach to the American fleet was disorienting. Many expected to encounter a screen of fighters near the carriers. Instead, they met resistance far earlier. Interceptions came at altitude, then again lower, then once more near the fleet. Radio chatter grew confused. Formations broke apart under pressure. Pilots trained for precision attacks now fought for survival. Fuel gauges dropped faster than anticipated. Navigation became uncertain. Some pilots turned back early, abandoning attacks to avoid ditching at sea. Others pressed on, only to discover that the carriers they sought were still dozens of miles away. Those who reached the fleet faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire guided by radar. Damage accumulated quickly. Escape routes vanished. Returning home proved no easier. Many Japanese pilots found their carriers had moved. Some misjudged distance and altitude, circling desperately as fuel ran out. Ditchings multiplied. Night recoveries claimed more aircraft than American fighters. For men trained to deliver a single decisive blow, the realization was brutal. The enemy could absorb losses and continue fighting. They could not. Courage was present on both sides. Skill was present on both sides. What differed
was sustainability. American naval aviation had become a system designed to forgive mistakes. An aircraft lost could be replaced, a pilot shot down might be rescued, procedures adapted, lessons traveled across the fleet within days. Japanese naval aviation had become brittle. Every loss was final. Every damaged carrier reduced capacity permanently. Every dead instructor shortened the future. The system had no elasticity left. This was not a failure of bravery, it was a failure of structure. As June 19 moved toward its decisive hours, this imbalance sharpened. The battle was no longer about individual engagements, it was about whether one side could continue launching aircraft at all. The answer would arrive in the form of radar contacts, approaching fast.
Shortly after 10 a.m., radar screens aboard American carriers began to fill. Contacts appeared at long range, faint, then unmistakable. Large formations, high altitude, coming in from the west. The first Japanese strike was airborne. Fighter direction officers acted immediately. Interceptors were launched in sequence, not in panic. Hellcats climbed steadily, guided by vectors calculated deep inside the carrier's combat information centers. There was no rush. Time was on their side. At approximately 10:30 a.m., American fighters made contact. The Japanese formation was still assembling, its aircraft spread across miles of sky. Before bombers could tighten their formations or descend to attack altitude, they were engaged. The first engagements happened far from the fleet, where Japanese pilots had expected relative safety. Losses began to mount quickly. American pilots, flying the F-6FH Hellcat, exploited altitude and numbers. Radar guidance allowed them to concentrate force repeatedly. A Japanese bomber group broken apart could not be reassembled. Survivors pressed on individually or turned back entirely. Yet more waves followed. Throughout the late morning and early afternoon, Ozawa launched successive strike groups. Each one faced the same reality: detection, interception, attrition. The American deck cycle absorbed the effort. Fighters landed, refueled, rearmed, and returned to the sky. Some American pilots flew 4 or 5 sorties in a single day. By contrast, Japanese pilots flew once, and often not back. By early afternoon, fragments of Japanese strike groups began to reach the American fleet. A handful of aircraft broke through, bombs fell, torpedoes were launched, but coordination was gone. Attacks were piecemeal, ineffective, and costly. Anti-aircraft fire finished what fighters began. American carriers suffered damage, but none were crippled. The system held. As the day wore on, the imbalance became unmistakable. Each Japanese strike grew smaller. Each American response remained full strength. By late afternoon, the sky itself seemed to belong to one side. Japanese pilots attempting to return faced a final enemy: distance. Many never found their carriers. Others ran out of fuel within sight of the fleet. Ditchings spread across the sea like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence already written. But the decisive moment had not yet fully arrived. That would come with the collapse of Japan's carrier air arm and the realization that there would be no recovery cycle to follow. As darkness approached on June 19, 1944, the outcome of the air battle was already beyond reversal. Japanese carrier decks were emptying, not to prepare for another strike, but because there were fewer aircraft left to land. Flight decks that had once held tightly packed formations now stood quiet, illuminated only by dim recovery lights. The pilots who returned did so alone, scattered, and often damaged. Vice Admiral Ozawa assessed his situation with brutal clarity. Hundreds of aircraft had been committed, most had not returned. The losses were not merely numerical, they were human. The majority of Japan's remaining carrier pilots, men trained over years, not months, were gone in a single day. There would be no second chance. That night, disaster compounded disaster. The fleet carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship, had already been fatally wounded. Earlier in the day, an American submarine, USS Albacore, had torpedoed her. Poor damage control and inadequate ventilation allowed fuel vapors to spread unchecked. By afternoon, a massive internal explosion tore the ship apart. Taiho sank, taking much of her crew with her. Not long after, Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, was struck by torpedoes from USS Kavala. She capsized and sank rapidly. Another irreplaceable carrier vanished beneath the sea. These losses were not isolated events, they were symptoms. Japanese carrier doctrine had assumed that carriers would launch decisive strikes before being found. But American submarines, radar, and air patrols collapsed that assumption. The fleet could not hide, the deck cycle could not be reset. On June 20th, the Americans struck back. Despite the long range, Spruance authorized a late-afternoon strike against Ozawa's retreating fleet. American pilots flew into the setting sun, navigating at the edge of their endurance. The strike damaged additional carriers and ships, further reducing Japan's ability to fight. Many American pilots ditched on return, rescued later by destroyers in one of the most dangerous recovery operations of the war. Even in victory, the cost of distance remained. But the difference endured. American losses could be replaced, Japanese losses could not. By the end of June 20th, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The carriers themselves still floated, but their decks were empty, their crews exhausted, their doctrine shattered. The clock had run out, not because Japan lacked courage or resolve, but because its system could not endure repetition. The battle's name would later be simplified, even trivialized, but for those who lived it, the reality was unmistakable. This was the moment the air war in the Pacific crossed a point of no return, and its consequences would echo far beyond the Philippine Sea. When the battle ended, the numbers told a stark story. Over the course of June 19 and 20, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 300 carrier-based aircraft. Many were destroyed in the air. Others were lost to anti-aircraft fire, ditchings, or failed recoveries. The majority of their pilots, some of the last fully trained naval aviators Japan possessed, were gone with them. The United States Navy lost fewer than 130 aircraft, most during the long-range strike on June 20. Many American pilots were rescued after ditching at sea. Some aircraft were written off, but the men who flew them often returned to fight again. In carrier terms, the imbalance was devastating. Japan lost 2 fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, and suffered damage to others. Even the carriers that survived were effectively hollowed out. A carrier without trained air crews was no longer a weapon, it was a liability. American carriers emerged intact. Damage was limited, flight decks remained operational, aircraft continued cycling even as the battle concluded. Within days, Task Force 58 was ready to support further operations. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese commanders understood what had happened. This was not merely a tactical defeat, it was a systemic collapse. Carrier aviation had been the Imperial Navy's decisive arm since 1941. Now it could no longer function as such. For American forces at Saipan, the effect was equally clear. The invasion fleet, once under threat, now operated without fear of major carrier air attack. Supplies flowed ashore, airfields expanded, the campaign continued with renewed momentum. Yet behind the statistics lay quieter realities. Wreckage drifted across the Philippine Sea for days. Oil slicks marked where ships and aircraft had vanished. Survivors clung to debris, many never found. The sea absorbed most of the evidence, but not the cost. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. What followed
would confirm it.
The Battle of the Philippine Sea did not end the Pacific War, but it ended Japan's ability to control it from the air. In the weeks that followed, the consequences became unmistakable. With Japanese carrier aviation neutralized, the U.S. Navy gained uncontested dominance across the Central Pacific. American task forces moved with confidence, no longer constrained by the threat of massed carrier strikes. Saipan fell in July 1944. Guam followed, Tinian soon after. From these islands, engineers carved runways out of coral and volcanic rock. Within months, B-29 superfortresses began arriving in force. By November, they were flying regular missions over Japan, something unthinkable before the Marianas were secured. For Japan, the loss of carrier air power forced a grim adaptation. Remaining carriers were retained as decoys or transport platforms. Aircraft shortages worsened. Pilot training deteriorated further. Naval aviation shifted from offensive doctrine to desperate improvisation. The initiative was gone. The Imperial Navy would attempt one last gamble in October 1944 at Leyte Gulf, but it would do so without an effective air arm, using carriers largely empty of aircraft, sacrificed to draw American forces away from the landing beaches. That decision traced directly back to the Philippine Sea. American doctrine, by contrast, accelerated. Lessons from deck cycles, fighter direction, and long-range strike coordination were absorbed and refined. Carrier task forces became faster, more autonomous, and more lethal. By 1945, they would operate off Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands themselves. Yet the aftermath was not triumphal for those who had fought. Pilots remembered the empty sky after the last interceptions. Deck crews remembered the silence after engines stopped. Rescue ships continued searching for survivors long after hope had faded. The battle's nickname, coined later, masked its gravity. What had occurred was not a rout, it was the collapse of a system under pressure it could no longer withstand. History would record it as a turning point. Those who lived through it understood it as an ending. And in that ending lay the shape of the war still to come. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was, in many ways, a battle against time itself. It was not merely a contest of courage, tactics, or machines. It was a test of endurance, of repetition, of a system's ability to function under relentless pressure. American carriers thrived because they could cycle again and again, repairing, refueling, and relaunching aircraft faster than Japan could respond. Japanese forces faltered not for lack of bravery, but because their system had no elasticity left. Every delay, every exhausted pilot, every lost aircraft compounded until the strike force could no longer exist as a fighting unit. This lesson resonates beyond the Pacific, beyond World War II. Modern warfare, air, naval, even digital, favors systems that can endure, adapt, and repeat. The courage of individuals remains vital, but it is amplified only by the rhythm and reliability of the structures around them. In the Philippine Sea, the invisible weapon was time, the measured seconds of takeoff and landing, the hours between refueling cycles, the days of pilot training and deck preparation. Mastery over these cycles created decisive advantage. For the men who watched the sky that June, the sight of planes taking off, landing, and relaunching was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The speed of repetition, the industrialized precision, revealed the mechanized nature of modern warfare, a reality that individual heroism alone could not overturn. The Philippine Sea proved that in a war measured in minutes and hours, systems mattered more than men. Endurance more than audacity, and in that realization lies the quiet, enduring legacy of what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a demonstration of how mastery over time and logistics can determine the fate of nations, even before a single shot is fired.